The weight of wings. Let me tell you about the moment before. Not the flight itself. Everyone wants to talk about the flight. The wind, the height, the Bosphorus below me, the crowd watching from the shores of 2 continents. Everyone wants that part. I want to tell you about the moment before. Standing on the top of the Galata Tower, with the wind hitting my face like a judgment, looking down at Constantinople spread out beneath me in every direction, and understanding with absolute clarity that what I was about to do had never been done by any human being in the history of the world. Not like this. Not with wings built from study and obsession and 8 years of failed attempts, and the specific kind of madness that looks, from the outside, exactly like genius, and feels from the inside exactly like terror. I was going to jump off a tower and fly across the Bosphorus Strait, or I was going to die. There was not much space between those 2 options, and I had spent the previous night lying awake in the dark, exploring every inch of that space, looking for certainty and finding none. My name is Hezarfen Ahmed Celebi. In the Ottoman Turkish of my time, Hezarfen means 1,000 sciences, a man who has mastered many disciplines. It was not the name my parents gave me. It was the name the world gave me after it decided what I was. Names like that are always retrospective. Nobody calls you a master of 1,000 sciences while you are still in the middle of failing at all of them. I was born in Constantinople, sometime around 1609. I lived in one of the most extraordinary cities in the world, in one of the most extraordinary eras in human history, in an empire that was simultaneously at the height of its architectural and cultural achievement, and beginning, in ways that only became visible later, to feel the first tremors of its eventual decline. I spent my life trying to understand how things worked, all things, the mechanics of the physical world, how birds generate lift, how air behaves under pressure, how the geometry of a wing translates wind into upward force, but also the mechanics of human things, how knowledge moves between civilizations, how an idea born in 1 century can lie dormant for 100 years before someone picks it up and asks the question the original thinker forgot to ask. I picked up a lot of dormant ideas. That was my particular talent and my particular curse. And one day, one specific, cold, extraordinary day, in approximately 1638, I strapped on a pair of wings I had built from obsession and mathematics and jumped off the top of the Galata Tower. This is that story. All of it. Not just the flight. Everything that made the flight possible. And everything that happened after. Part 1. The Boy Who Read Everything. 1609 to 1625. Constantinople, in the early 17th century, was a city that contained the world. I want you to understand what that actually meant in practical terms, because it is easy to say and harder to feel. The Ottoman Empire at its peak was the great crossroads civilization of the known world, the point where the trade routes of Asia, Africa, and Europe converged, where goods and languages and manuscripts and ideas all passed through the same narrow straits and left traces of themselves in the city's texture. The Grand Bazaar, the libraries of the mosque complexes, the workshops of the instrument makers in the Bayezid district, the coffee houses where scholars and merchants and travelers from a dozen different linguistic traditions sat in proximity and argued about everything. The shipyards at the Golden Horn, where Ottoman engineers were doing things with wood and rope and geometry that their European counterparts would not match for decades. I grew up inside all of this, and from a very young age, I was constitutionally unable to encounter any of it without needing to understand how it worked. My father recognized this in me early. He was a man of modest means and immodest intellectual ambitions, who had somehow produced a son even more constitutionally restless than himself. He found me tutors. He took me to the libraries. He introduced me, when I was perhaps 10 years old, to an instrument maker named Mehmed Effendi, who worked in a cluttered workshop near the Suleymaniye Mosque, and who was the first person I ever met who treated my relentless questions as a pleasure rather than an imposition. Mehmed Effendi made astrolabes and quadrants and compasses, the navigational and astronomical instruments that Ottoman sailors and scholars depended on. He understood mathematics with an intimacy that was almost musical, the way some people understand language, not just the rules of it, but the rhythm underneath the rules, the places where the system breathed. I spent 3 years in that workshop. I swept floors and organized tools and listened to everything Mehmed Effendi said about everything. And when he ran out of things to say to me, he started lending me manuscripts. The manuscripts changed everything. The libraries of Constantinople in the early 17th century held some of the most extraordinary collections of scientific and philosophical manuscripts in the world. Arabic translations of Greek texts, Persian mathematical works, Chinese technical documents that had arrived along the Silk Road, and the accumulated scholarship of the Islamic Golden Age that European historians of science were only beginning in my lifetime to properly reckon with. I read all of it, or as much of it as I could access, which was considerable because I was persistent, and because librarians, in my experience, respond well to genuine curiosity expressed with sufficient patience. 3 bodies of work shaped me most fundamentally. The first was the work of Ibn Firnas, Abbas ibn Firnas, the 9th century Andalusian polymath who had, in approximately 875 CE, constructed a pair of wings from silk and eagle feathers and launched himself from a mountain near Cordova. He glided. Not far, not well controlled, and he landed badly and injured his back. But he flew. A human being flew under his own constructed wings 750 years before I stood on top of the Galata Tower.
Ibn Firnas understood something that most people in his era did not, that bird flight was a mechanical problem, not a miraculous one. That if you could understand the mechanics, the shape of the wing, the angle of attack, the relationship between surface area and body weight, you could reproduce it. You could engineer it. The sky was not a forbidden zone. It was an engineering problem waiting for the right tools. He got the engineering partially right. What he got wrong, he noted himself in his own writing, the lack of a tail structure to control descent. He understood his own failure clearly enough to document it, which is something only genuinely good scientists do. I read his account, and I understood it was unfinished business. Not a failed experiment, an incomplete one. The second body of work was Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, or rather partial copies of portions of them that had traveled through various Mediterranean scholarly networks and arrived in Constantinople in fragmentary form. Da Vinci had spent years studying bird flight in the late 15th century, filling pages with observations and mechanical drawings of ornithopter designs, flying machines with flapping wings, mechanisms for translating human muscle power into wing movement. Da Vinci's ornithopters were never built successfully in his lifetime. The mechanisms were too heavy, human muscle too weak to sustain the required wing motion. But his observations of actual bird flight, the way wings curve to generate lift, the role of feathers in managing airflow, the mechanics of banking and turning, were extraordinary. He saw things that most people looking at birds every day for their entire lives never saw.
I copied his observations into my own notebooks and spent 6 months watching birds from the shores of the Bosphorus, comparing what I saw to what he had written. He was right about almost everything he had directly observed. He was wrong about the mechanism, the flapping, the muscle power, the attempt to replicate bird flight exactly, rather than extract its principles. That distinction between replicating a system and extracting its principles became the central idea of my work. The third influence was Lagari Hassan Celebi, a man I will tell you more about shortly, because his story and mine are entangled in ways that illuminate both of us.
I should tell you about the city I was reading in, about what it was like to be young and intellectually ravenous in Constantinople in the 1620s. The coffee houses were the center of intellectual life in a way that no single institution, not the universities, not the mosque libraries, not the palace itself, could quite match. Coffee had arrived in Constantinople in the mid-16th century, and by my time, the coffee house culture was fully established, hundreds of them across the city, each with its own character and clientele. The one I frequented most was near the Galata Bridge, on the European side of the Golden Horn, in the district that had historically been the home of Genoese merchants and was by my time a cosmopolitan mix of Ottoman Muslims, Greek Christians, Armenian Christians, Jews, and the occasional European trader or diplomat passing through. In that coffee house, I encountered, over the years, a remarkable range of human beings. An Egyptian mathematician who had extended the work of Al-Kashi on decimal fractions, a Venetian glassblower who understood the optical properties of curved glass with a precision that would have made him a wealthy man in any European city, a Greek physician who had read Vesalius and was trying to reconcile Vesalius's anatomical findings with the inherited medical tradition of Galen and Ibn Sina, a Persian musician who was also, improbably, one of the finest practical astronomers I ever met. These were my people. Not because we agreed about everything. We argued constantly, loudly, with the specific energy of people who are arguing about things that genuinely matter to them, but because we shared the assumption that the world was understandable, that it operated according to principles that could be discovered and articulated and applied, and that the discovery of those principles was the most worthwhile thing a human being could do with the limited time available. I was, by the time I was 20, completely and irreversibly in love with that assumption. I was also, by the time I was 20, beginning to think seriously about wings.
Part 2. The Science of Flying, 1625 to 1635. Let me explain what I actually understood about bird flight, because the historical accounts of my work tend to describe me as someone who simply strapped on feathered wings and jumped off a tower, which misses the decade of systematic study that made the jump survivable. A bird's wing is not a paddle. It is not a surface that pushes against air to generate upward force the way a boat's oar pushes against water. It is an airfoil, a curved surface that when moved through air at the right angle, creates a pressure differential between its upper and lower surfaces. The air moving over the curved upper surface travels faster than the air moving under the flatter lower surface. Faster moving air creates lower pressure. Lower pressure above, higher pressure below, the wing is pushed upward. This is lift. Ibn Firnas understood this intuitively, without the mathematical framework to describe it precisely. Da Vinci observed it empirically, without quite arriving at the pressure differential explanation. The mathematical framework, what we now call the principles that Bernoulli would formalize in the following century, was not fully available to me either. But I understood the phenomenon through years of observation and experiment, even without the formal language to describe the mechanism.
What I observed, systematically, over several years of watching birds from the Bosphorus shores, large birds, Eagles, storks, the great pelicans that migrated through Constantinople in spring and autumn, did not primarily fly by flapping. They soared. They extended their wings and rode the thermal currents of warm air rising from the heated land and water, making small adjustments with their wingtip feathers to bank and turn and maintain altitude. The flapping was for takeoff and landing, for short bursts of powered flight. The majority of their time aloft was passive, riding air, not fighting it. This was the insight that separated my approach from Da Vinci's ornithopters. The ornithopter tried to replicate the flapping mechanism. I was trying to replicate the soaring mechanism, not the engine of bird flight, but the glider component, the part that required no muscle power at all beyond the initial launch. A human being cannot flap wings fast enough or powerfully enough to generate sustained lift. Human muscle, applied to a wing mechanism, produces perhaps 1/10 the power-to-weight ratio that a bird's flight muscles produce. Da Vinci knew this and spent years trying to solve it mechanically, with gears and levers, and never quite solved it. I accepted it as a constraint and worked around it. The question was not how to generate powered lift, but how to generate enough lift from passive soaring to carry a human body safely from a high point to a low point, across a gap, across a distance, without the controlled fall becoming an uncontrolled one. This reframing of the problem took me 3 years to arrive at. 3 years of dead ends and wrong assumptions, and the particular frustration of knowing you are close to something without being able to see it clearly. And then I arrived at it, and everything changed. The wing design I eventually settled on was a fixed-wing glider, rigid enough to maintain its airfoil shape under load, light enough to be carried and launched by a human body, large enough in surface area to generate sufficient lift for a controlled descent at an acceptable angle. The materials were the challenge. Wood for the frame. I spent months testing different species for the right combination of strength and lightness, eventually settling on a specific construction using thin strips of cedar laminated together for the main spars. Silk for the wing surface. Ottoman silk, the finest available, stretched tight over the cedar frame and sealed with a solution of beeswax and linseed oil to reduce porosity. The whole structure reinforced at the stress points with thin strips of treated leather. The geometry, the precise curve of the wing surface, the angle of the leading edge, the taper from root to tip, was the part I spent the most time on. I built and tested perhaps 30 different wing profiles, first in small scale using paper and split bamboo, launching them from elevated points and watching how they flew, adjusting the geometry based on what I observed. This is not how flight engineering is described in the histories. The histories say, "I built wings and flew." They do not say, "I failed 30 times before I built wings that flew." They do not say, "I spent a winter testing scale models from the roof of my workshop in the Galata district." They do not say, "I broke 2 fingers catching a failed prototype that came down wrong." Failure is the actual content of invention. The successful attempt is just the last in a series. I should tell you about Hezarfen Celebi, because his story runs parallel to mine, and because what happened to him is part of what gave me the specific quality of determination I needed to continue, when continuing was difficult. Hezarfen Celebi was a fellow Ottoman inventor, a man I knew by reputation before I knew him in person. He was older than me, perhaps by 15 years, and he had been working on a different problem, not gliding, but powered flight, specifically rocket-powered flight. In 1633, 5 years before my own flight across the Bosphorus, Hezarfen Celebi launched himself from a point near the Topkapi Palace in a conical rocket of his own construction.
powered by gunpowder. The rocket carried him upward. Accounts vary on the altitude, some saying hundreds of feet, some saying higher. When the fuel was exhausted, he deployed a set of wings, glided, and landed in the Bosphorus, where Ottoman sailors pulled him out. He survived. He had flown under rocket power. He had, by any reasonable measure, accomplished something extraordinary. Sultan Murad IV watched the demonstration. He reportedly said it was impressive. He gave Ligari a bag of gold coins. And then he exiled him to Crimea, for reasons the historical record does not entirely clarify. Possibly because the demonstration had attracted too much attention, possibly because there were concerns about what rocket technology in private hands implied, possibly simply because Murad IV was a man who found unsanctioned brilliance threatening rather than useful. Ligari Hezarfen Celebi died in Crimea. He never returned to Constantinople. His work was not continued. I knew this story. I knew it before my own flight, and it sat in my mind during all the years of preparation as a specific kind of warning that being right, being brilliant, being the first was not sufficient protection against the institutional forces that preferred the world to remain the shape it had always been. I flew anyway, but I understood what I was flying into. Part 3. The Galata Tower, 1638. The Galata Tower had been standing since 1348, originally built by the Genoese as a watchtower at the highest point of the Galata district, on the European shore of the Golden Horn. By my time, it was a fire watchtower, used by Ottoman officials to spot fires breaking out in the city's crowded wooden neighborhoods. It was approximately 67 meters tall. The height above sea level, accounting for the hill on which it stood, put the top of the tower perhaps 90 meters above the waterline of the Bosphorus. I had been thinking about the Galata Tower for 6 years. The geometry was favorable. The tower's height provided sufficient altitude for a gliding flight across the Golden Horn to the Asian shore. The prevailing winds off the Bosphorus were generally from the northeast, which would provide additional lift if I timed the launch correctly. The distance to the Asian shore at Üsküdar was approximately 3 kilometers, which my calculations suggested was achievable given my wing design's glide ratio, the distance traveled horizontally for every unit of altitude lost. My calculations suggested this was achievable. Calculations are not flight. This is the gap that inventors live in, and that no amount of calculation ever fully bridges. The day I chose was in approximately 1638. The historical sources are not precise about the date, and I will not invent precision that does not exist. What I can tell you is that it was cold, a clear winter day, the Bosphorus dark blue below me, the Asian hills visible across the water with the particular sharpness that cold air gives distant objects. I had told people what I intended to do. This was both a practical necessity, I needed assistance getting the wings to the top of the tower, and a deliberate choice. I wanted witnesses. Not for vanity, because an unwitnessed flight is a story that only you can tell, and stories that only one person can tell are stories that the world finds easy to disbelieve. Word had spread through the coffee houses and the market districts. When I climbed to the top of the Galata Tower that morning, there were people watching from the shores of both the European and Asian sides of the Bosphorus. There were people in boats on the water below. There was, I was told afterward, a crowd of several thousand by the time I was visible on the tower's observation gallery. Sultan Murad IV was watching from the Sinan Pasha Palace on the Asian shore. I did not know this when I jumped. I found out afterward. I am not sure whether knowing would have changed anything, but I find I am glad I did not know at the time. The wings were assembled on the tower's gallery by my 2 assistants, young men from the Galata district who had helped me with the final testing phase and who understood the construction well enough to put it together correctly under pressure. The harness system, the mechanism by which I was attached to the wings and could control the angle of attack through movements of my body, had been the last problem I had solved, and the solution was still not as elegant as I wanted it to be. A pilot's weight shift transmitted through the harness to subtle changes in wing geometry. It required constant, active management. There was no passive, stable configuration. I had to keep making adjustments, reading the air, responding to the variations in wind pressure across the wing surface. I had practiced this as much as I could from lower heights, small hills, rooftops. None of those preparations were equivalent to 67 meters and 3 kilometers of open water. I stood on the gallery railing for what felt like a long time, and was probably less than a minute. The wind was correct, northeast, steady, approximately the speed I had been hoping for. Below me, the Golden Horn, and then the Bosphorus, the dark blue of the water, the small shapes of boats, the Asian shore visible across the water with its hills and the pale stone of the Üsküdar district. I had done everything I could do in preparation. The only remaining thing was the thing itself. I stepped off the railing. The first second was not flight. The first second was fall, the pure stomach-dropping freefall of a body obeying gravity before the wings had time to generate sufficient airspeed for lift. A fraction of a second that felt like much longer, in the way that extreme moments always expand time. And then, the wings caught. I cannot describe it adequately. I have tried in the years since, in conversations and in writing, and language is not sufficient to the experience. The closest I can come is this. Imagine that you have been fighting your entire life against a force you took to be absolute and immovable, and then, in one moment, that force simply accommodates you, negotiates with you, agrees on the basis of sufficient preparation to let you pass. The air took my weight. I was flying, not soaring effortlessly. I want to be precise about this, because the romantic version of the story removes the difficulty, and the difficulty is the point. I was working, constantly adjusting the wing angle, reading the pressure changes through the harness, banking slightly to the right to catch a thermal current I could feel more than see. It required total concentration, of a kind that left no room for any thought beyond the immediate management of the flight. But I was flying. The Galata Tower was behind me and below me. The Bosphorus was below me. Constantinople was below me, spread out in all its extraordinary density and noise and color, visible from above in a way no human being in the history of that city had ever seen it. I crossed the Golden Horn. I crossed over the Bosphorus. The Asian shore came toward me. The hills of Üsküdar. The buildings growing larger, details becoming visible that had been abstracted from the distance. I landed on the Asian shore. Not elegantly. The landing was the hardest controlled part of the flight, the moment when the speed had to be dissipated without catastrophic impact, and I ended up rolling rather than walking it down. But I landed, intact. I had flown approximately 3 kilometers across open water from a height of approximately 90 meters. It had taken approximately 15 minutes. I lay on the ground on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus and listened to the distant sound of the crowd that I could not see, and breathed the cold winter air, and thought, Ibn Firnas, Leonardo, 8 years of failed prototypes, 2 broken fingers in the winter of 1633. Done.
Part 4. What comes after the impossible? 1638 to 1640. Sultan Murad IV sent for me. This was expected. I had, after all, performed my flight with full awareness that the Sultan was watching. When a subject of the Ottoman Empire does something unprecedented in full view of the Sultan,
the Sultan tends to have opinions about it. Murad IV was a complicated man to appear before. I have described him elsewhere in my accounts of this period as someone whose qualities were both extraordinary and dangerous in ways that were difficult to separate. Brilliant, physically imposing, with a genuine interest in spectacle and achievement, and also with the specific volatility of someone who had spent his childhood in mortal danger and emerged from it with a permanent hair-trigger relationship to perceived threats. He had watched me fly across the Bosphorus. He had watched 3 kilometers of open water pass beneath a human body that was, by the laws of physics as everyone in that watching crowd understood them, not supposed to be in the air at all. His reaction, when I was brought before him, was not what I expected. He was not frightened. He was not dismissive. He was genuinely, visibly impressed. The impression of a man who has seen something that reorganized his understanding of what is possible, which is a specific kind of impression, and not a common one. He gave me a bag of gold coins. He called me Hezarfen, the 1,000 Sciences Man, which was not my name until that moment, and has been my name ever since. And then, after the gold and the name and the genuine appreciation, he said something that I have turned over in my mind for every year since. He said, "Such a man is dangerous." Not dangerous in the way a criminal is dangerous. He meant it differently. The way a force of nature is dangerous. Something that operates outside the categories you have built to contain and predict the world. A man who can do what everyone agreed was impossible is a man who might next do something else that everyone agrees is impossible. And the Sultan cannot predict which impossible thing that will be. I was not executed. I want to be clear about that, because some accounts suggest otherwise, and they are wrong. But I was not kept in Constantinople either. I was exiled to Algeria.
Algeria, in 1638, was an Ottoman province on the North African coast, a significant city, a functioning port, part of the empire's Mediterranean network. It was not a punishment in the way that a prison is a punishment. I was not deprived of my freedom, or my income, or my ability to work. I was deprived of Constantinople, of the coffee houses, and the libraries, and the instrument makers, and the scholars, and the specific intellectual density of the city that had made me who I was, of the community of curious, difficult, brilliant people who had been the air I breathed for my entire adult life. This was the punishment. Not the cage, but the distance from everything that had made me capable of what I had done. I thought about Ligari Hassan Celebi a great deal in the first months in Algeria. We had both done the impossible and been rewarded with gold, and then removed from the place where the impossible might be attempted again. The logic was consistent. The empire needed people capable of extraordinary things. For architecture, for military engineering, for navigation, for the 1,000 practical applications of systematic knowledge. But extraordinary things performed privately in the service of the state were different from extraordinary things performed publicly in front of thousands of witnesses that demonstrated what a single individual could accomplish outside the structures of state authority. A man who flies across the Bosphorus on wings he built himself is a man who has demonstrated to everyone watching that individual human ingenuity operating outside official structures can accomplish things that official structures have never attempted. That is inspiring. It is also, from the perspective of a sultan trying to maintain the authority of those structures, deeply unsettling. I understood this. Understanding it did not make it easier. Part 5. Algeria and the Work That Continued, 1638 to 1640. I did not stop working in Algeria. This is important to say clearly, because the exile is sometimes described as the end of my story. The flight, the gold, the
the exile, the end. But exile from Constantinople was not exile from curiosity. I could not take the Bosphorus with me, but I could take everything I had learned, and everything I was still learning. And the questions that had driven me for 20 years did not stop being questions because the geography had changed. Algeria had its own intellectual life. The port city brought scholars and merchants and travelers from across the Mediterranean world, from the Maghreb and from sub-Saharan Africa and from southern Europe. The trade networks of the central Mediterranean concentrating human knowledge and human ingenuity in ways that were different from Constantinople's, but not lesser. I found in Algeria a community of scholars working on problems in optics and navigation that were connected to questions I had been thinking about for years. The relationship between lens curvature and focal length, the use of astronomical observation for maritime navigation, the mathematics of projectile motion, which was, in ways that I found immediately interesting, connected to the mathematics of gliding flight, through the shared question of how a moving object behaves under the competing forces of velocity and gravity.
I wrote. I had been writing throughout my years of flight research, notebooks, calculations, observations. But in Algeria, with fewer practical experiments to run and more time for reflection, I wrote more systematically. An account of my flight research, an account of the flight itself, a series of theoretical observations about the principles of aerial navigation that went beyond anything I had been able to articulate while I was still in the middle of the practical work. Some of those writings survived. Others did not. The ones that survived exist in fragmentary form in various archives: the Ottoman Imperial Archive, the Algerian National Collections, private manuscript collections in Istanbul. Scholars have been piecing them together for centuries, and the piecing continues. I think about those fragments sometimes, the way ideas survive, not intact, not complete, but in pieces that are recognizable to people who know what they are looking for. A calculation in the margin of someone else's manuscript, a reference in a later scholar's footnote, the specific shape of a problem formulated in a particular way that tells you, if you know the intellectual history well enough, exactly who was thinking about it. My ideas survived in pieces. I will take that.
I wrote. I had been writing throughout my years of flight research, notebooks, calculations, observations. But in Algeria, with fewer practical experiments to run and more time for reflection, I wrote more systematically. An account of my flight research, an account of the flight itself, a series of theoretical observations about the principles of aerial navigation that went beyond anything I had been able to articulate while I was still in the middle of the practical work. Some of those writings survived. Others did not. The ones that survived exist in fragmentary form in various archives: the Ottoman Imperial Archive, the Algerian National Collections, private manuscript collections in Istanbul. Scholars have been piecing them together for centuries, and the piecing continues. I think about those fragments sometimes. The way ideas survive, not intact, not complete, but in pieces that are recognizable to people who know what they are looking for. A calculation in the margin of someone else's manuscript, a reference in a later scholar's footnote, the specific shape of a problem formulated in a particular way that tells you, if you know the intellectual history well enough, exactly who was thinking about it. My ideas survived in pieces. I will take that. The work I did in Algeria that I am most proud of is not directly related to flight. It is a series of observations about the relationship between wind patterns over open water and the behavior of birds in those wind patterns. Specifically, the way large seabirds use the boundary layer between fast-moving air and slow-moving air just above the water surface to sustain flight with minimal energy expenditure. What the seabirds were doing, I eventually understood,
was a technique that aeronautical engineers of the 20th century would independently discover and name dynamic soaring, the extraction of energy from wind gradients, moving between layers of air moving at different speeds to gain altitude without powered flight. I did not have the mathematics to describe it completely, but I observed it, I documented it, and I understood its fundamental principle, that a flying body does not need to fight the wind. It needs to understand the wind well enough to use it. This is true of more than aeronautics, but aeronautics is where I found it.
Part 6. What the Flight Meant. Legacy. I died in Algeria, sometime around 1640. I was approximately 30 years old. The cause is not recorded with any certainty in the historical sources, which is the kind of archival silence that tells you the death was not considered important enough to document carefully, which is its own kind of statement about how exile ends. 30 years old. I had done the impossible at 29 and spent 1 year in Algeria and then died. The brevity of it used to bother me more than it does now. Now I think differently about it. Not with resignation. I am not a man given to resignation, but with a different kind of arithmetic. What I did in 30 years. I identified the correct theoretical framework for human gliding flight, fixed wing rather than flapping, passive lift rather than powered thrust, 2.5 centuries before Otto Lilienthal made the first documented successful glider flights in Germany in the 1890s. I built a working glider from materials available in 17th century Constantinople, cedar, silk, leather, beeswax, that carried a human body 3 kilometers across open water. I flew. Not metaphorically, not in a dream. On a cold day in approximately 1638, I strapped on wings I had built from 8 years of study and 30 failed prototypes, jumped off a 67-meter tower, and flew across the Bosphorus Strait, while Sultan Murad IV watched from the Asian shore, and several thousand people watched from both shores and from boats on the water below. It happened. The historical sources that recorded it, Evliya Çelebi's Seyahatname, the great 17th century travel account, is the primary one, are not the sources of fantasy. Evliya Çelebi was a careful and generally reliable chronicler who described what he had heard about my flight from people who had witnessed it. It happened. I did it. And then I was exiled for doing it. And I died young. And the work was not continued. That last part, the work not being continued, is the part that costs the most. Not my exile. Not my death, which came when it came and could not have been argued with. The discontinuity, the gap between what I understood and demonstrated in 1638 and what the world was able to do with that understanding. It was 250 years, 2.5 centuries during which the correct framework for human flight existed, demonstrated in a historical record, and the world was not ready to pick it up and run with it. I think about why a great deal. The easy answer is the institutional one. The Ottoman Empire in the 17th century was not structured to develop and apply technological innovations of this kind. There was no mechanism for taking an individual's discovery and translating it into a systematic research program. No universities in the European sense, no scientific societies, no state-funded research programs, no patent system to incentivize inventors by protecting their ability to profit from their inventions. The less easy answer is the human one. Ligari Hassan Celebi and I both flew and were both exiled. The message that sent to anyone else in the Ottoman world who was thinking about flight or about any other radical technological innovation was clear. The expected value of pursuing radical ideas in a public, demonstrable way was gold coins and exile. Possibly just exile. Knowledge that cannot be shared safely does not accumulate. It exists in isolated pockets,
in individual minds. And when those minds are removed from the networks that could extend and develop the ideas, through exile, through death, through the 1,000 ways that power structures manage the people who make them uncomfortable, the knowledge does not disappear, but it goes dormant. It waits.
It waited 250 years for Lilienthal. It waited 300 years for the Wright brothers. I am not bitter about this. I want to be clear about that, because bitterness is easy and also useless. The Wright brothers solved the problem correctly and completely. And what they built changed the world in ways I find, if I am being honest with myself, genuinely thrilling. That human beings fly today. That flight is so ordinary that people are bored by it. That cargo moves between continents in hours. That the entire surface of the Earth has been made proximate. This is the outcome of the problem I was working on. I was one of the people who worked on it. That my contribution was early and incomplete, and then sat dormant for 2.5 centuries, does not diminish the fact that it was a contribution. But I think the 250 years mattered. I think human beings could have been flying in a systematic and developing way significantly earlier than they were if the conditions for innovation had been different, if the knowledge had been shareable, if the demonstration had led to a research program rather than a bag of gold and a one-way trip to Algeria. That is the loss. Not my personal loss, the human loss. The centuries of possible development that did not happen because the structure of the world in that era was not capable of doing with the knowledge what the knowledge deserved to have done with it.
The air has always been there. Here is what I want you to carry away from this. The air was always there. The physics of lift were always true. The mathematical relationship between wing geometry and gliding performance was always real, was always waiting to be discovered and applied. The sky was not closed. It was never closed. It was just unexamined. What made the sky closed was not physics. Physics was on the side of flight from the beginning. What made the sky closed was the assumption that it was closed. The inherited certainty of every generation that told the next generation that human beings do not fly, cannot fly, will not fly. So do not waste your time thinking about flying. Ibn Firnas did not accept that certainty. Neither did Da Vinci. Neither did I. Neither did Ligari Hassan Celebi, flying on a gunpowder rocket over the rooftops of Constantinople 5 years before I crossed the Bosphorus on silk and cedar wings.
None of us solved it completely. All of us moved the problem forward. The knowledge accumulated, dormant and fragmentary in manuscripts and chronicles and the margins of other people's notes, until the moment when the conditions were right for someone to pick it up and finish it. This is how almost all knowledge actually moves through time, not in the clean, linear progression that textbooks describe, but in bursts and dormancies, in individual minds working in isolation from each other on the same problems, in ideas that arrive before the world is ready for them and have to wait. The question worth asking is not who solved the problem. The question worth asking is who kept the problem alive during the long centuries when solving it was not possible. Who wrote things down? Who documented failures carefully enough that the next person could learn from them? Who demonstrated, at personal cost, that the problem was worth solving, that the sky was accessible, that physics was on our side, that the only thing between human beings and flight was the work of understanding. I kept the problem alive. In one specific, cold, extraordinary morning in Constantinople in 1638, on a pair of silk and cedar wings, for approximately 15 minutes over the Bosphorus, I kept it alive. 2.5 centuries later,
someone picked it up. And now you are alive in a world where flight is so ordinary that you have to remind yourself, occasionally, that it is a miracle.
You are welcome. All of us who kept the problem alive. Ibn Firnas with his eagle feathers, Ligari with his gunpowder, me with my cedar and silk. We are all in that miracle. Look for us there. We are in the air. We have always been in the air. We were always going to be.